Hi, good evening. First of all, it's really an honor to be here and to present for you guys. Thank you so much, Pankaj, for having me. We've been having this sort of conversation around technology for a while now, and so the presentation is it's titled Methodological Limits to Spatial Technologies. And what we're doing in the presentation is we just walking. First of all, it's really an honor to be here and three geographies, right? And thank you so much, Pankaj, for having me. Lots of technologies have we've been having this sort of conversation around what end and what sort of challenges we face. And because so now presentation is in titled Methodological Limits to Spatial Technologies, that the presentation is we just walking. First of all, it's really an honor to be here and three geographies, right? And thank you so much, Pankaj, for having me. Lots of technologies have been having this sort of conversation around what end and what sort of challenges we face. And because so now presentation is it's almost like the title Methodological Limits to Spatial Technologies, that the presentation is mainly just walking. First of all, it's really an honor to be here and three geographies, right? And thank you so much, Pankaj, for having me. Lots of technologies have been having this sort of conversation around what end and what sort of challenges we face. And because so now presentation is it's almost like the title Methodological Limits to Spatial Technologies, that the presentation is mainly just walking. First of all, it's really an honor to be here and three geographies, right? And thank you so much, Pankaj, for having me. Lots of technologies have been having this sort of conversation around what picture and what sort of challenges we face. And because so now presentation is it's almost like the title Methodological Limits to Spatial Technologies, that the presentation is mainly just walking. First of all, it's really an honor to be here and three geographies, right? And thank you so much, Pankaj, for having me. Lots of technologies have been having this sort of conversation around what picture and what sort of challenges we face. And because so now presentation how technology has been used differently. For example, presentation is used as a method to legitimize. So the technology was, and the last one is Calicut. We had conducted an urban studio in KRA where we saw. The studio itself was trying to study the area of Calicut and the peri-urban areas, and the kind of development pressure, etc. that we have. And it was looking at a way to use technology as a way to benchmark, to sort of compare and evaluate things like accessibility or equity, etc. So we're just going to go through these, and what I want you guys to maybe just look at in every presentation is just the sort of challenges that we faced and what might have been a more obvious sort of observation had it been a more engaged sort of field practice as opposed to what happened in the studio. So it is essentially a collection of failures and reminders, not really failures because a lot of them did eventually become good projects, but also was a great reminder for us as architects about the perils of also just kind of depending too much on technology. So the first example I want to go around is the studio work. So this is a studio project that was done for the Masters of Urban Design. This was held at KRA in Mumbai. So there's a bunch of urban design and urban conservation students who have to go to Calicut to study. They've identified these sort of various places in Calicut, again based purely on remote sensing and digital technologies. And they've gone to those areas and now they're trying to study the space through various lenses. So in this case, we were looking at accessibility, how different sort of spaces in that region are variably accessible. What are the factors that kind of make them accessible, etc. And we were looking at using, there was a lot of GIS that was of course used. We were using remote sense data to kind of even arrive at where to go and study, right? And we depended. So this was, I think, the third year of us experimenting a lot with the code for urban analytics in our studios, because typically architects and planners and urban designers, we love these flashy drawings and just poetic. But for the first time in century, we actually have tools that can help us pulse the cities now, right? So, Michael Bagley famously says that now that we have the tools to pulse the city, it is irresponsible and ethically incorrect on our part to assume, that the city requirements can be met by someone's whims and fancies, which is what used to happen, right? You'd have a Corbusier, or you'd have some sort of planner who looks down at the city from the sky and starts planning it without necessarily understanding what the city was. So because of this ability to now be able to pulse the city, we've been trying to incorporate a lot of that in our studios as well, and this has been sort of eye-opener also for in some senses. So what happened in the studio was that, of course, they went around collecting a lot of the sort of basic information that you collect about cities. Right? That's building footprint, you have your roads, you have vegetation, etc. And a lot of this was remote sensing. Now, they did go to site, they spent 6 days on site, and then they came back. But the way the studio was structured also partly, for the studio as well, there was a sort of analytics studio that was going on the site, and then there was the design studio that was going on the site, right? And they're working on the same site. So they are creating these sort of urban analytics models and these sort of representations and trying to base their designs in studio off of these analyses, right? And it is very easy to kind of create each of these, what used to take perhaps months of analysis and even just, an exercise of drawing was done in 5 minutes because of LLM. So we've been promoting the use of LLM to just code, whether it's DeepSeek, we've been running our DeepSeek models, or whether it's using ChatGPT, whatever students are comfortable with. So they've been using these as ways to generate these sort of urban analytics maps, right? And the problem with these is that these excite you. They're interactive, they're dynamic, they're usually pretty cool looking. They give you this illusion of having understood the truth without actually having known it. And I think that's the power of representation that these kind of tools also provide. Now, this is the sort of typical workflow that they have, right? So they're basically using LLM, in this case, they're using ChatGPT, and they're sort of giving prompts saying, I want to analyze this about the city, I want to analyze that about the city. And ChatGPT is giving them the prompts to create these maps. And this is the first point where thought starts to be accumulated in the city. You stop thinking about what it is you want to actually analyze. In this case, this is a very fantastic student actually. He's the one who recognized this law eventually. But what he says is, I have 3 data sets, and he says this figure down, count boundaries, street data, etc. He asks ChatGPT what use cases are possible to study in the part. Right? He says, I like the accessibility analysis part, and then he says, what are the other things you can do? So you can see that it's almost an ideation phase here, right? But what ChatGPT is doing is baking it into what code it's giving us. So there are a lot of things that should have ideally been prompted here with regards to what needs to be studied, but because it feels almost like every time students are giving a prompt and the LLM is returning a code, what's happening is that these very crazy maps that are being created, right? And he's obviously excited, what I'm like Iron Man and Tony Stark and all of that. And what happens is that you miss out on really thinking about what the LLM is doing. So this is one of the maps that we created, and what this shows is, I don't know if you can see it, but there's some yellow buildings here as well. This little patch here in the center actually has these yellow buildings which show the least accessibility. So what this map shows is, all of the ones that are dark blue are the areas with most accessibility in terms of transport and mobility. And the ones that are going lighter towards the yellow are the least accessible. So yellow markers that you see these evidence, they are actually proposed metro stations that are going to come up in that area. And the ones in red are bus stops. Yeah. Now, this map was used as gospel truth for the studio. This is the area with the least accessibility. This is the most accessible space. So we can afford to not pay too much attention to this area. Whereas this area needs a lot of attention. We're going to flood it with paratransit and do all of this and that. And this became a sort of baseline based on which the student was working through the studio until one of these conversations we talked about how is this possible, because they had gone to site And they realized that a lot of the stories were happening here. When they were talking about the story, they were like, oh yeah, there was this place we went by auto and then wahan pe jaake ruke, etc., etc. All of that is happening there, not here. So that strange little conversation then just started, getting us to probe a little bit. And what happened was, so this is just, I'm just going to try and explain the problematic part of the code. So what the LLM gave our code actually said in this case, in this code, what it's saying is, these are the sources you need to get. So it's asking the computer to sort of read these shape files for roads, and it has given shape files for buildings, etc. But it has also asked it to import the metro station. And what is not being realized here is that the code is intended to import the metro stations as functioning metro stations. Whereas these are proposed metro stations, they don't exist there in India. Right? The other problem here is that it says use OSM, OpenStreetMaps, to get all of your data. Now, OpenStreetMaps, for those of you who've used it, I'm sure you've noticed that there's very limited features that are marked on it. If there are 17 bus stops in India, it probably has 2. Right? A lot of buildings are missing, a lot of roads are missing, they're misaligned, highway carriageways, etc. are mislabeled. There are a lot of issues like that. So, at the very onset, there is this sort of procedural error here, right? That the source files that you're working off of are themselves not right. And again, it's because they're having, but this is more of a procedural problem, more of a problem that could have been solved just by a simple check. The other bit of the code that's actually very problematic, and this is a very insidious problem here, is that this is the logic, this is the main part of the code that gives the map the logic. What should be colored as blue, indicating high accessibility, and what should be colored as yellow, indicating low accessibility. In this case, now what it says is if there is a metro station,
Hello. Good evening.
this is not how it works in our context, right? Our most efficient graph mathematics tool in, especially in cities like Kozhikode, are auto rickshaws. Right, so auto rickshaws actually should have the highest weightage in this case, whereas it's the metro transit that's getting the highest weightage. Now, it's not very hard to predict why this happened because a lot of these, so there are a lot of these established urban analytics rules, right? OSMNX, space syntax, etc., etc. And these basically prescribe a set of relationships that tell you how the city works. Now, in this case, most of this data has been trained on these sort of data sets from the West, where the transit lines are more like they do deserve more weight. Now that is crept into this code, and without realizing, we've incorporated that bias as part of our own learning. Right? So this is what ended up actually just messing up the entire observation. So what instead should have happened, and that's what happened when I don't have an updated map. What happened is this entire relationship inverted. And what you realize is that firstly, that you have to update a lot more of the bus stand, which had to be done by going to ground, by observing, by taking photographs, by taking GPS routing on ground. The other thing that happened was that this logic of accessibility completely shifted. And the way they were designing a studio completely shifted. That month and a half of design basically was wasted. Right? Because their assumptions in studio themselves were wrong. And this really was sort of eye-opener movement because we had also been pushing because for some reason in academia especially there is this constant need to run to catch up and we've got to be at the bleeding edge of things and which is why we've been leaning so hard into LLMs and code for urban study. But this has been a very sort of landmark moment for us to just stop, slow down and get students to actually understand what it is that they're doing before doing the how of it or actually starting to work on the project. The next project is closer home. This was in Mumbai, and there's actually 2 examples of technology in Mumbai that went out. This was probably the most famous. So around 2015, I think 2014-15, the SRA, the Slum Rehabilitation Authority of Mumbai, decided to conduct a comprehensive slum map of Mumbai, right? A mapping exercise where, because remote sensing technologies was such a big thing, and GIS was all the buzzword, like all of your documents from BMC had GIS in it for sure. And there are some very strange tales also about how in GIS, when they started putting the data, their areas were wrong, their all kinds of quantification was wrong, but the GIS was becoming a thing, right? So at that time, the SRE decided to use remote sensing and GIS as a way to map slums in India. So in this case, what the tools that they were using were basically Sentinel-2 imagery, Sentinel-1 imagery, some sort of just basically just visibility. It's not even like any of these sort of different wavelengths where you can kind of send concrete, etc., etc. It was a very basic exercise that probably all of the students of architecture would do at this point. Just go on Google Earth, go there and say, oh, this is my site, etc., and try to understand the site. Right? So this was the exercise, and they want to demarcate to tools. Now, the idea was to legitimize or delegitimize these settlements, because this was going to be the basis on which developers could claim that this is slum and I can develop it a certain way. Now, it may seem okay for just other informal settlements where the conditions are already bad, but remember there are also a lot of other places in Mumbai that may not necessarily fit our idea of what a formal building is, technically, right? And it becomes problematic in that case, because in this case, what is happening is the entire exercise depends on us identifying slum-like features. What you see in front of you, this is Worli Kolivada, and this is what that looks from the satellite. This is the map that showed slum area. So anything that's colored in this color is a slum cluster according to the map. Right? Now you can very clearly see that it's been marked as a slum cluster, all of these places. Now, what happens is that this Worli Kolivada area is one of the foremost Kolivadas, the fishing villages of Mumbai, right? And the morphology of the places, the way the buildings are made, is very different from our typical, flat roof, RCC sort of building. And the tool, of course, was looking at this image. These are images from 2012. I think these are cognitive, no, Maxar. Maxar images from 2012, and this is what you could see. And essentially, the process involved, calling a consultant would hire a team, they would all sit on it and they would look at a screen, they would look at these things and say, "Ha, this is slum," right? And then you start marking it out. So what you see here is a slum area, or an informal settlement, and what you see here is actually a Kolivada, which is a fishing village. To the naked eye, it essentially looks the same, right? And that is where the fundamental flaw of this entire project lay. That we were depending too much on the visible, on the optical, to make decisions about things that actually impact people's life, their livelihoods, and their home. This is Marul. So you see, all of these areas have been marked as slums. Now, Marul is home to one of the oldest Gauthans, or one of the oldest East Indian villages in Mumbai. Many of these East Indian villages are now very famous, Potachiwadi, etc., and almost like Goa, Bombay, etc. But these also share the same heritage. They share the same sort of built form as well. Now, what happens in these cases is that there are these informal settlements around that get classified as informal settlements. But all of these areas where you have these sloping roofs, these are actually the sloping roofs of the old sort of East Indian bungalows. Okay? Now, they also get classified as slum areas. Now, the problem is, and which is what ended up happening, that people were up in arms, because what being on that map meant was that the SRA would call in developers and ask you to just up and back, so that they would redevelop and give you formal housing. And this formal housing was around between 250 to 350 square feet. These guys were used to living in sprawling bungalows with their own gardens and kitchen gardens, etc. And obviously, there was a sort of uproar against it. The same thing was applicable to Kolivadas. And the frustrating thing was that the Kolivadas and Gauthans were both recognized as valid forms of urban morphology, and they were mapped in earlier land use maps as well. So they had to end up actually scrapping the whole thing. It became a big issue. They ended up getting another because they said that the problem was that satellite was good. So I'm good drone around. So then they started flying drones at 500 meters, running into the same problem again, because no matter how close you are, the colors of the roof and things like that, they still remain the same, right? And ended up this exercise ended up being scrapped, and then actually had to get people to go down. So there were massive tenders floated for this, and there were actually the sort of door-to-door surveys that were then conducted to ascertain whether these were slum settlements or not. And most of these ended up getting removed from that, but you still see occasional issues crop up because these maps are still what, like I said, what we map is what we design, right? So these maps are still what guide the development of Mumbai. And because of that, these kind of issues do keep coming up every now and then. And there's a lot of people who say this is basically a land grab exercise. The developers, they came in and they said it's supposed to market, so we can just develop them. And I mean, there's a whole lot of issues like that. But this again exposed these fault lines to this rapidly adopting any technology, especially because of the sort of optics around the technology itself. This is again, I'm not talking about the Mumbai leg of this, but this was a project that was running. It's actually a pretty great project. It's called Idea Atlas, and the idea was to make to prepare this sort of global data set of the informal settlements. And it was supposed to be an AI-enabled platform where the sort of platform would firstly detect all of these informal settlements and predict the kinds of firstly the extent of these. Then, they also had all of these components of actually getting in pilot cities. All of these cities that you see here, they were the pilot cities. And you had these researchers who would verify whether the extents that were marked were correct, etc. But one of the fundamental parts of this project was to map what's called urban deprivation. Right, so they had their own idea of what urban deprivation was. And the idea was that you could use a combination of so the entire toolkit was the stack, right? So they had central 2 imagery, which gave you optical images. So it was basically a satellite view. You had central 1 synthetic aperture radar images, which basically gave you things that you wouldn't be able to see through the cloud or see through the screen. And then you had Google Open Building data set. So these three together were used to build their idea of what these settlements may be like. And then, of course, there was a lot of frontier research, especially by people like Monica Kapoor, who have worked on how to classify these spaces based on features, based on their proximity to roads, etc. And they've used these sort of convolutional neural networks to try and identify these. On the surface, the technology seems great, sounds great, and it works fundamentally well enough. But the problem is, so this is the interface that you get. So this, I mean, we run a sort of pilot in KRV where there was an exercise. The idea was team kind of came, and we had a bunch of people sitting around and trying to map, firstly looking at the predictions. So all of the yellow points that you see, they are predictions of where it may be an informal settlement. The red ones are predictions of where it may be a formal settlement. And we were kind of doing a cross check, and because we knew the site, we were supposed to mark these out and say, no, this is an incorrect prediction or it's a correct prediction. Right? So this is what the interface looks like. Now you can see that it is starting to classify all of this as informal data. Now, when it does this, this is also anyway. So all of this is classified as informal build-up. It is making an aesthetic judgment on what an informal settlement is. Right? These are not necessarily informal settlements. A lot of them have been regularized. They are buildings that have all of these services, etc. More to the point, they are trying to look at these sort of conditions for what is called urban deprivation. Right? So they're saying these are select the relevant deprivation. Housing conditions may be bad, environment and climate may be bad, infrastructure and services are lacking, social and security aspects are lacking. You have settlement layout and densities too bad, etc. And these are the deprivations that these have, right? So that's the idea of prediction. Now, the problem is that this is trying to do this at a global scale. And these are just the pilot cities. If you look at the build form of each of these, it's very evident that you cannot use the same aesthetic measure to try and understand what is an informal settlement. In fact, quite possibly what you see in Bangalore might just be considered a decent row housing in Mumbai. Right. So it is impossible, firstly, to have a uniform idea globally. Like, I mean, so this is Mumbai, this is supposed to be informal settlement, but these, if you consider informal settlement in Jakarta, that then throws off the logic completely in Mumbai, right? So that is, of course, one of the fundamental flaws in the methodology itself. But this is where it gets a little trickier because you're trying to map something like urban deprivation using only satellite images, only a God's eye view, right? And even within that, so what you're supposed to do is essentially, if you see that there is something that is incorrect, or if you feel like there is a settlement that I can mark out as a informal settlement, you take a polygon, you start marking these out, and if you select it as an informal build-up, it will give you options to select which kinds of deprivation exist here. Now, this is based on, of course, the premise that whoever is making this knows that there is a deprivation. But when this is scaled up, it is not necessarily possible to always have that ground truth. Secondly, my bias of what may be a deprivation in, let's say, housing conditions may not be the same as the other researcher who's sitting like one computer across. Right? So there are all of these sort of biases that creep into the system, which makes it very fuzzy. And that fuzziness does not allow it to become this sort of meta tool that it was imagined to be. There's another fundamental problem with it. This happens, this selection of deprivation, etc., happens when you select it as an informal settlement. If you select it as a formal settlement, it doesn't allow you to select any deprivation because formal settlements cannot have any deprivation at all, right? And if you look at this Slum Rehabilitation Authority, I can bet that this has at least most, if not all of those deprivations, right? Look at the sheer density, there's no light, there's no ventilation. The people who are living here, they're living away from the livelihood. So all of those deprivations that they were supposed to be marking in your informal settlement, they exist in the formal settlement. But just as a system, the way it's designed, it is designed to ignore deprivation in formal settlement. It assumes that the moment you formalize something, it becomes you've kind of lifted people off of the deprivation. And that, again, is a very, very fundamental flaw in the way we're looking at cities themselves. The last one that I want to show you, and this I took to last because it's a little more fun and not as depressing as the other one. So this is Mayapuri Island, also called Elephanta Island. This is off the coast of Mumbai. And so this is actually an archaeological site. So this is very famous for these Shaivite caves, these second century Shaivite caves. And in fact, that second image, that's also the logo for Maharashtra Tourism Development Corporation, right? So very famous, very well known, but the problem is, of course, that this is because it's an island, it's hard to access. Most of the residents, there are three villages, that's Morabandar, that's Shepandar, and there's Rajbandar. These three villages do exist, but most of the residents, they step out of the island in the evenings because there's barely anything on the island. There's no fuel, there's barely any signal, electricity, that I all of this. Now, because there isn't a lot of development here. Off late, what has happened is that, not really off late, since the 1970s, the Archaeological Survey of India had a lot of interest in the different kinds of artifacts that were being found around the island. And these were artifacts that were not necessarily linked to the Shaivite caves. So, and these were sort of surface all across the island. And variable was brought in to try and digitize this sort of method. So the way the ASI works is that you will have the sort of core ASI group itself. You'll have the core ASI group itself with its officials and its researchers, but you'll also have these different colleges, Deccan College, for example, or Samaya College, for example, and they'll have their own set of students and their field experts who come in, and they sort of roam the island, right? And wherever they find these artifacts, they make a note of it. There's something called an antiquity register, which registers different details of what has been found, etc. And we were trying to streamline that process a little bit. So what we ended up doing was creating this toolkit. It was called an archaeological field tool, very bad name, but it was essentially just a tool that every researcher had with them. So anytime you would find an artifact, you would firstly pull up the app, and of course, because there's barely any signal, this had to go offline as well. Now, you pull up the app, you kind of decide, you select the kinds of discovery, etc. You mark the position of the artifact itself. It might use your device GPS, or there are also these QR codes that you put everywhere, which marks the location of the artifact itself. Then we start asking you other questions. So this is just recording the GPS. The moment the accuracy, because this is relying on your phone, the moment the accuracy comes down to 5 meters is when it locks it and says, this is where I found it. And then I start asking you other questions. Like, first you take a photograph. usually a scale photograph with some sort of a scaling device within the photograph. It will ask you for the name, it will ask you for material, it will ask you for the dimensions, the length, breadth, height, it will ask you for orientation, level from the reference, it will ask you for the inclination, etc. Now, all of these data points, and because we will have sort of one field for just every field. Now, all of these data points are extremely useful. We'll talk about why it is great. But the moment someone finalizes this form, right, they've just discovered this artifact, they've entered this. What happens is that this becomes a point on a map, right? And that was our essential sort of goal, to have all of this spatial data be there on dashboard, so we could it could sort of inform decision making about where to actually dig, where to excavate. So one point on this, right? And then we have all of these teams that are going on the island, constantly collecting this, and there were hundreds and hundreds of artifacts that were collected. Right? And what happens is that you start to see a heat map of where these objects were found, right? And the ideal situation was that these heat maps would allow us to decide where to excavate, where to lay our trial trenches, where to start digging, etc. Now, at Variable, we are a team of architects, urban designers, all of us, like in a very sort of pigeonholed field. Now, when we were doing this, while it was a very incredible technology, the field experts, some of the archaeologists from ASI, we were having this discussion. Like it seemed awfully weird that some of these heat maps, they seem to be in places where you've got only the same kinds of artifacts, whereas it might be nice to have a range. Which is when we realize that our own assumption, because location and with location, Cartesian knowledge is so important for architects. We base all of our decisions on location. यहाँ पे ज़्यादा artifacts मिले, dig there because you have more chances of getting stuff there. Fair enough as an assumption if you are coming into the field new, but what the problem that comes in there is that you may not want to only identify places that have the same kind of material. So then, on consideration, some of these equals the you need to consider for these heat maps, not just where, but also things like what is the material that was found, what inclination was it found at, what orientation was it found at. Because unlike other excavation sites like Harappa, where it's flat, and if you dig, basically every layer is just telling you what came before and what came after. So very linear. In Harapuri, because it is a slope, there is a continuous process slope on. So what happens is that these sort of artifacts are constantly churning up. So your layers that are below may not necessarily be the oldest one. Right? So all of this information became critical. Now, because of that, when we tweaked the algorithm and then we ended up getting these heat maps, we realized that the actual heat map, the spots that were most promising were not the ones that came purely from location. They were the ones that came with these sort of additional parameters, like material, orientation, etc., etc. And this is then that corrected sort of map is what then allowed us to plan our excavation. This is a geographic map of the 1970s excavation plan, and you'll see that actually most of the stuff that we found, most of our heat maps, they are contrary to what was suggested in 1970. That though was closer to that sort of wrong assumption that we had made about location, because at that time also I would assume that the reason why those 3 points of mark is because that's where most of the things were found. But regardless, these excavation points were planned. So firstly on our geospatial database, and then that was then translated onto the ground using your DGPS and your total stations, etc. And that then finally got sort of embedded into the real geography. And then we went ahead and excavated these, so these are the different excavation trenches that you see here. And some of the discoveries that we've found here, that the ASI has found here, have been staggering, right? Like a lot of them are narrative altering also, just in terms of timelines. For example, even Earn that eventually they thought at the time of taking this photo, we didn't know that it was there, but there were 2 copper plates inside, which actually established dynastic presence here in Bombay that was not established earlier. This also cements the position of Bharapuri as that one location where larger ships, would dock, unload their stuff, get into smaller sort of boats, and then go up the creek to Sopara, which is where the main port was. Right? So there are a lot of discoveries that ended up happening, and just a wide range of discoveries that happened because we were able to look past just where we found the most stuff. but instead also try to understand what the quality of that material was, what the nature of that material was. And that came in only when we were able to break out of our own silo of just, like architectural thinking or planning thinking and started to be open to suggestions from other fields, which in this case was absolutely. So, I mean, those are just the four sort of examples that I want to share with you guys. But I think this is more relevant now, especially because we're living in a world where there is constantly a lot of data that's being created, right? And this is in more ways than one now affecting the way we live. Especially now, considering the largest exercise that we have coming, right, which is the census for 2027. This is going to be the most digitally driven census in history. It's going to be geolocated. The points I think are also much greater than earlier census. And what will happen is over the next 5 years, a decade, or if what we've seen so far is the next census won't happen anytime soon, right? So we will be working off of this data to plan our city. And the way, and a lot of these professionals who are right now in colleges looking at LLMs as a way to generate their analytics, etc., they need to be aware of all of these sort of biases that creep in when you use them, all of these little nuances that need to be understood, and that sort of increasing peril of not wanting to engage with site and not wanting to go somewhere, saying that God's eye view of mine will help me decide what cities are. We are ending up essentially going back to what the problem was when Corbusiers of the world were designing cities. They were sitting on a table and imagining the city from the sky. And some weird reason that cycle has now come back where because of these analytical tools, we are now again going back to the God's eye view. And that is something that is very problematic and we need to break. So, and it's a conscious sort of effort that needs to happen. All of these tools that we use, there is absolutely no need that we should just take them for granted, assume they're correct. And architects, planners, designers, we all need to be part of the development of these tools, which is why open source development is so important, right? We need to make sure that all of those biases that have crept in, they don't creep in because of a lack of availability of contextual data and things like that. So yeah, that's been the presentation. I'd love to hear if you have any questions.
Mike. Anyway, so thank you. Thanks, Ankush. Thanks so much. That was so fascinating. 2 or 3 quick. Get the mic. Nobody help you. I think two or three things that strike me. The first case is, I think, the idea of the black box. That inside, what went into that data set for looking at Kochi and Calicut, and what came out. So obviously, we really know what's inside. And like you said in the end, that context and understanding that. The striking example of Bombay is how technology is not at all neutral. How it actually can aggravate between that technology that we have to solve a problem, but they end up actually making the very nice example. Third one is how it can work. So, before we open it up, I have one kind of general question. You've spoken largely about urban context. One can assume that this probably will apply to Google as well. But do you have any quick insights on, because we are focusing more on rural areas, technologies for rural areas. So, in your work, are there some interesting insights about what might be slightly different in rural areas, or will this really, these concerns and these stories apply by and large and probably look at where rural areas are concerned? And or if we have to use these technologies and work in rural areas, what might we need to be even more careful about? Considering certain distinct differences between the realities of rural and say urban. Any thoughts from your experience or any extrapolations you might have? Then we'll open it up.
Actually, one of the case study that we used to do in school, I think it was Surat, and they were looking to, they're basically looking to mark out where cultivation would have been happening over a long period. And I think they were using satellite images and things like that to establish whether cultivation had been happening here on this farm for a long time, etc., and whether you can a certain ownership. Now, and the problem of course in India is now because there is so much interest in technology, especially in the rural sector, whether it's drone TV program, whether it's all of this sort of hyperscalable analytics models which will give you just crop yields and things like that. A lot of this kind of technology scale, I think, faster in the villages now than cities themselves. Now, the problem in these cases is that these refuse to acknowledge even just simple password system like that. Case, for example, there were times when the entire field would be left uncultivated for a very long time for us to recover nutrients, etc. And that was never registered in, which again become a problem to cry and all that. But these kind of nuances that urban dwellers may not, because a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of the people who are working on these systems at the ground up, like designing them, they are people who are in the urban market. So a lot of these kind of nuances and these these things that you would only know if you were part of that or you were there for a while, you would never be able to incorporate. So I think more than ever, it is important to start getting your field associations, your relationships with people, the way you engage with field, they have to really now start catching up, because there was a time when field observation was the only way you would, and that of course had its own set of biases and it is not scalable, etc. But now at the risk of scalability, we are at the risk of losing that. So I think just that sort of the way we engage with site, the way we engage with field, even setting up technologies to try and get these sort of ground up, a lot of things to try and understand things from ground up was very simple. What happened? With one of our projects, what we realized was that we were studying places in LGMP, and we were doing all kinds of analytics and saying, forest and this, that. The simplest thing that came out of the project was just that the Adivasi Padas, they decided to make one common work country. And that became a fundamental way for them to, stake claims, whether it's the FRA, right? So we need to find technology alternatives, in these rural areas that can give us more granular data. And that has to be a problem that has to be done.
Yeah, we'll open this up for, and like I always said, we wait for the PhD and the professor for little later. We have the master, and we also have a lot of guests from the architect community from outside IIT. So maybe we can be good hosts and also give them a chance to grill their own professor. But before that, maybe Siddhara, people who are not looking at their smartphones and their computers, suddenly stop looking when I said that. We actually we have a lot of architects. There I think maybe in our 40, 50 master students, about 15 at least architects and planners. So they were strong. We had a good start to the series. Yeah, who has a question? Sudeepa? Yeah. Please,
hello, my name is Shubhika. I am second year master student. I also have a background in architecture. Yeah. So my question was, you talked about how Kolivada and all the slums are different from each other. Well, like slum is basically a considered overcrowded place. To simplify it, overcrowded place with lack of civic amenities. So, how do you propose you're distinguishing all the slums in urban context? Because it is quite complicated. In our classes also we did few works like mapping out the city. So it is a complicated. So how do you propose to distinguish, and also how do you define particularly what is slum, what is formal, and what is informal?
So firstly, this this sort of systemic sort of need to classify legal, illegal, formal, informal. That has now started to get eroded. I think that's the first distinction we need to make. That there isn't really a clear black or white. Right? Like if you go to Dharavi, for example, Kumbarwada in Dharavi, it is a settlement that is a water settlement. It has a morphology which is very unique. It's one of the loudest places in Bombay, Dharavi, like the 90 people. But right next to it is Kumbarwada, where if you just enter it, maybe within 5 to 6 meters, suddenly everything goes silent. Right? And that silence happens because the way the potters they dry their pot, it almost creates like a buffer, like a barrier, and it becomes almost like silent. Now, things like that wouldn't have been obvious because of any of the kind of technologies that more people end up using. The first most critical deviation that we need to make is from away from the birthright. Right. Which is why I think even Google is happening in these days right now. Sending out people with backpack ideas on the back end. They're going around. MIT Sensibility Lab was actually working a lot of umbrellas. They were actually trying to map the favelas and the brown ones. And I think that is well aesthetic. I don't think it is about making a judgment on whether something needs to do or not, because there's no denying that the services are inadequate and that you need it. The complication comes in when it is a question of legitimacy. Like those kinds of schools are used to tell you that you are not allowed to be here or you're not allowed to have middle this way. That is when it becomes a problem, because like I said, it's a livelihood, right? Where the houses are always built in the precarious state because they're actually cheap. The houses have always had spaces for livelihood related activities, electrician, etc. So the way the morphology is developed, it is that way. That is the aesthetic that it develops to. That aesthetic, unfortunately, sort of looks very similar to what we consider as modern. And that has become the problem where we're trying to create aesthetically. So the need of the art is actually to start getting in more nuances beyond the eye, things that are more experiential, things that are more based on rural history, things that are based on legacy, on stories of livelihood, etc. And just lineage of people who have lived in it. That has been the most fundamental conflict in cases where we're trying to have these things.
I come to you. We have anybody else? First year. Yeah. Yeah, okay, you're new entrant. Yeah, you introduce yourself. You architects speak a lot.
Really?
Good evening, sir. I'm Shweta Deshpande. I'm the first year PhD student. I'm also in
Okay.
and then I was with that. So my question was that now it was actually the question was clarified because you said that the mapping is happening because they want to understand legitimacy of a certain place. What I want to understand is what is the action that they're determining after that, because if the category is determined by whether a place is legitimate or not, and in general we're trying to understand as architects, even as people, that a certain place is livable or not. So criteria is like local clarifications, and LCZ is a very thorough paper, which can be utilized in understanding if a place is actually livable or not. So why isn't that a part of such a survey? Why are we mapping all of this? What are we doing to do?
I think, I mean, that's a great sort of example of using LCZs as your stand-in for livability. Please be safe. Right.
What is the LCZ? They are all ignorant.
Looking analytical, studying microclimates in a way to try and understand whether it's a suitable living environment. Right now, there has been a lot of academic interest in this. The problem is that most large-scale exercises like this that come from the state, the priorities and your mandates are very different. In this case, the mandate is to establish ownership and patterns of this leasing and things like that. Right? In that case, very clearly the lobby does not see any benefit in trying to bring in something like that. Like, why would you, on purpose, bring something like that that can call into question? I want to develop this land over the next 5 years. Why would I bring in a process that will probably churn the thing for another 8 years? I wouldn't, right? Which is why a lot of these processes are opaque by design. Even just the fact that to compete with these claims, I challenge any of you, go to the MCGM website and try to find me a slum map and try to find me a development plan sheet. They're there. They're there, but they've been hidden in so many layers. It's almost like it's intentionally done. Right? And the idea behind all of this is that you try to hide behind technocracy, and just like you said, like what the action is, right? In this case, while the data is this sort of quantitative analysis of what kind of areas are, etc., the action is essentially just that same quantitative response. These are the people. I divide those by the number of people you've identified. You get into 250 square feet, and that quantitative action is all you get. Whereas if you were to look at more of these experiential sort of methods, that quantitative action is irrelevant, right? Because you cannot go by that logic at all. Which is why, of course, by design, a lot of these things are a little dicey. But it is also very nice to see a lot of citizens groups actually starting to build their way ground up. A lot of the problems that come up from this sort of top-down thing can be mitigated by what's called open source urbanism. Just like even people have tried this. DigiThane. There was this sort of app in Thane that was tried at one point. where citizens were able to kind of, submit their own grievances, etc. Even BMC has, I think, a fairly functional lab, at least for potholes and things like that. In Sweden, there have been experiments with digital democracy, where almost every decision, like urban decision, is like a plebiscite, where you have some sort of a system on your phone, and then you're voting on each of these. So it's not whimsical, but it's actually coming from the requirements of the people, etc. So there are attempts like that, but unfortunately, why a lot of them don't creep into mainstream urban planning is because of these lobbies that actually push for like some of the biggest criticism of that map was that the SRA was never consulting with the people; they were only consulting with the builder lobby, and the builder lobby in Bombay is very powerful. So it is in their interest to have these classified as the informal sector. So I think these two sort of aspects, I think if you're able to match up, you might be able to do better than what we were doing so far. A way to justify it. Yes, yes. Essentially, that's what it is here in this.
Yeah, it comes to one, and then it's again, then it's
Hello, sir. Myself John again. I'm second year PhD student. First of all, a takeaway from this that I understood is the issues with the technology. And this a bit of rectification was there, but somewhere I am a pro technology, and I would like to not agree with everything what you have said over here. So the reason is, first of all, any technology becomes robust because first of all it depends on the intent of the person who uses it. Second is the scientific temper. Third is the in-depth analysis. So the problem over here is these kind of studies that are done. I work with the Maharashtra government as well. So the MRS, Maharashtra Remote Sensing Center, whatever they publish, there is a lack of technical expertise. There is lack of, there are improper georeferencing done. So the whole thing is the first thing that I studied when I did my MTech in remote sensing in GIS is that no map is complete without ground truth. So you need ground truth. So they are completely ignoring it. That map itself is wrong. So now the first thing is, and the way we do it is we collect data, and then 70% of it is used for calibration or training, and then 30% is used for testing or validation. And then these maps should be published, which is not happening. Which means again it is an issue of intent, scientific temper, in-depth analysis. So this technology is being misused. Second thing is the Forest Survey of India conducts forest mapping, and there was a point of time, I had said this before during the seminar, that forest cover was increasing every year, and this was because definitions were manipulated. 2.5 hectares of land in an NDVI map was considered to be a forest, and then they changed the definition to 1 hectare of land from now onwards in an NDVI listing is going to be forest. So whatever was already there was mapped now. So this is an issue of intent more than a technological issue. Second thing is the Western model algorithms definitely agree with you, and the resolution of this data also matters. So somewhere more than like my inspiration to come to Sitara was technology. Somewhere we shouldn't put technology so down because there is a lot of other factors because of which technology is being buried. So this is my thing that I wanted to put up here. You can agree or disagree. And yeah, that's it.
No, thanks for the question. I completely agree. I mean, to be honest, like this has almost been painful as a realization because my entire professional trajectory, including the firm that I run, is completely technologically driven, right? These, like you said, right, like intent and the sort of competence that you require. I think what we've been doing, even just looking at these own projects, is just to understand what it is that went wrong and what we need to make sure that we're doing that we're correcting. The point is not to say that these technologies should not be used, especially at a scale. I mean, the densities that we working with in India, it's not possible. It's not plausible to not use technology and still try to get the kind of impact that we need. So it is. I mean, there's absolutely no denying that these technologies have to be used. But the only problem is that because of the way these have been used so far, especially when I see that in sort of academic sphere, the kind of people we are pushing out, like you said, that lack of technical competence is now not only becoming technical, but also even just conceptual. Like because of the ease of these technologies, right? I mean, if you were to be serious about that studio that I showed you about in Calicut, right? it is mind-boggling that someone would just ask LLMs to give you a word, whatever, this is what I want to study, and actually not give it the sort of parameters and attributes it should be considering at all. Right? But that's becoming a problem in the education sphere as well, that people are now letting go of thought and looking to these sort of markers of competence, these maps, these dashboards, the new thing, right? Like everyone's making dashboards for everything. But most of these dashboards don't say anything because of these the lack of these checks. And that's what the point is. I don't think I'm saying that this technology should not be used. They absolutely have to be. In fact, what they need to be is more rigorously used. And I think the most important thing is to not really evaluate things in college. I've also been trained in an engineering college and all that. You've always been evaluated on our output, and like what is it that you were able to get. The problem really lies when when in cases like this, the output is not worth evaluating. What you should ideally be evaluating is your inquiry. How has the student structured that inquiry? Has he been able to? Has she been able to? At least get all the attributes that matter in place. Have they been able to imagine the framework properly, etc.? Those are what need to be evaluated. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to happen. I don't think it's so much about rejecting technology, but it's also just about our relationship with technology and what we see with it. So that's
Hari, let's hear it. Anyone else?
Now, my question is also on the same lines. In the RS and GIS, RS is only one part. In the GIS part, the ground truthing is what is going to make the difference.
right.
And then the observations and the decision taking.
Right.
But in the first place, why you started with the ChatGPT picture and started saying that this is what we loaded and this is what the output that came. Maybe for a student project when they are not aware about the differences between the Western way of looking at and the current our local conditions. Yes, these kind of things will come in. But as a true scientist and a technocrat, always we will look at both ground truthing data is much more to speak on compared to just association.
Right.
So, and when multiple stakeholders are also involved in a particular group, everyone will look at it with a different lens.
Right.
And ultimately, what is available on the ground is only going to be set down, right? So if you can highlight that component of that technology, that will be useful.
So you mean the component of technology that actually allows for this ground up data to come in, is it?
No, I'm not.
I didn't understand the question.
Question is not that. See, don't it appears from your seminar that technology, there are gray areas in using RS and GIS technologies, and you stop there. But the ground truthing part and plus the various stakeholders, how they will approach
Right.
it.
You mean how these could have been corrected, you think?
In any given situation of community looking at the whole thing, community means various stakeholders I mentioned here. Everyone will come with their own way of analyzing the whole thing. But somebody, if they wanted to demolish someone, they wanted to build up, they will come with a story of things. But the carrying capacity, all those layers we need to build.
Right.
This is what I'm doing.
Right. Yes, correct. No, that's a very valid observation. In fact, I mean, that's what coming from these learnings, that is exactly what we need to start incorporating more, both in practice as well as in our academic sort of courses and fees as well. Because the kind of things, even if it's just an academic exercise, this is what people carry into practice eventually. And I think it needs to be corrected right at this stage. Right.
Two last questions, Hari and then Rohit. There are many Haris here.
Thank you for the talk. It was very insightful and thought-provoking, especially because something that we always think what exactly happens when we plan for employment or what happens when we use the technology is actually coming from a person who either heard with the ground and not really completely clear, or as a person who analyzed the data of the local because we are not complaining about all the technologies, we are complaining or we are criticizing the technology that we are using for the others. Like we are deciding on others by using the technology that we have. And while we all know this, that there can be manual errors and other aspects, I am trying to connect it to what I use in my PhD thesis: informality, formality, and legality, not to the research of technology alone. So we know that the power and the technology and the governance go hand in hand. And as theoretical framing of legal and illegal is also decided based on informality, formality. So basically, the elite urbanism is considered good, and how those ones illegality or encroachment is considered illegal. So that is mentioned by how in her work very clearly about universities, especially Mumbai. So my question is more empirical rather than theoretical. Your standpoint as an architect is very clear, as a critic and as an activist, like understand from the means as a critic to the what is happening in the urban planning. When a person working in architecture and planning, how much you can say the state and the government used to exclude, or how did this exclusion happen despite being not having a proper map, as you have said, or not clearly having it, because it impacts a lot of people, and how the exclusion, through a few examples, if you could say, it's more than from your experience point of view. I'm asking, is it because people who use the technology correctly by keeping exclusion at the center of analysis or inclusion at the center of analysis?
So, long and complicated question.
Question.
It's a very nice question. Thank you very much. Now, Martin, do you want to? No, you don't get a chance to respond. You fight afterwards. People are walking in quick. No, hang on. Later. We have to decide. We have a seminar on that. Should we take another question from Rohit and then or you want to answer this one?
No, we can do
You keep it.
I will keep it in my RAM.
Thank you for the talk. I'm very here. So, you very beautifully explained the political economy behind this technology work. So my question is that there is always going to be some groups or the other who is driven by that political economy and promote certain ideas of everything. For example, classifying areas as using that technology. So through your work, were you able to alter the definition or guideline or how the different state departments look at that particular problem? So were you able to reach out to them to revise their policies or the policy documents? If yes, then how were you able to do it? And if not, what were the challenges that you faced?
I think maybe like there are some sort of overlaps. So I think that sort of point of exclusion that you mentioned, right? Or the opposite of that, being able to access it, like exclusion. I think that also sits fundamentally at the center of this entire debate. Because what happens is that these design these systems, of course, they're not thought out completely, or they may lack a lot of attributes that they need to have considered, etc. But I think the fundamental difference, the fundamental challenge is also that most of this, the information that is generated from this, that affects your everyday life, is not actually easily accessible to you. And that convolution that
Give an example.
yeah, so like I said earlier, right, like even just to try and access the development plan of the city, or to try and understand you, I mean, you're in a position where I can literally order with a computer and it'll come to me in 8 minutes. But I'm still not able to try and understand what part of what kind of land reservation my plot comes. I mean, there are of course ways to do it, but there's a lot of friction in that process, and that friction is design. MCGM website is like a maze of God knows where. There's no way you can find it. And the same thing that exists on one page today would not exist there 4 months later. It's in some other section, some other subdomain altogether, right? And again, it is something that is very intentionally designed. In Goa, with the large sort of the protest against planning exercises and all these things are happening, they made it a rule that you have to make sure that all of this is published. Now, they made sure that they are adhering to that, but that was just compliance because they had one large map that was printed and framed and put out at the office. And then, if you wanted another map, you could pay get a map. That was the only way of accessing the development plan that is built by people who you are paying. And is supposed to affect the way you are going to live. So even just these methods of access, that I think fixing that becomes crucial. We have not been able to do it as efficiently as possible, but definitely not as impactfully as needed, because you really need to be working with the government. So with the ASI, for example, or with these small sort of bodies, every now and then, ad hoc, we've been able to at least bring in an element of transparency. Because in this case, I mean, even if you're collecting all kinds of data, I would argue that as long as all of that data is available publicly, there will always be something, because that's the whole spirit of open source, right? Like you publish a software and you leave the source code open so that there are other people who might have a different problem to yours. They may be able to tweak it, or there may be people who may not have noticed something at all that other people somewhere else in the world are able to. So as long as there is transparency about this data set, and as long as there is transparency about the inferences that are being drawn from the data, I think that would be a step closer to just maybe not inclusion, but at least in avoiding exclusion.
Were you part of that process? You are also part of the planning that was.
Yes, yes. So in case of the Garaguri project, for example, we were there right at the beginning of this. So this is a completely new exercise altogether. Try and build a process like this for the scaling up activation and all that. So in this case, we are now able to enter ground up. But when it comes to things like the city, now because these are legacy institutions with a lot of process procedures and compliance in place, it is very hard to enter them from that sort of ground up, right? But we have been actively trying to go through SKT as well as the way we are trying to work with municipal organizations. And there is a lot, like we are now working on a project collecting data about water bodies in Netherlands. So even just making simple things like making everything OGC movement, open geography consortium compliant, making sure that all there are a public portal that you don't have to fish through different places and things like that. I think those are now things we are trying to make into most of our work with what those.
Something you had some very quickly, loudly.
So it's very interesting lecture. So I have that how you distinguish that slow, that space, your paper mixing is happening. Then you have that correction.
Right.
How you is it some archaeological process or?
So these are so the way archaeologists define the sort of slow wash, they have these calculations for what may or may not have washed at the same rate, right? So based on that, but in this case, I mean, it was not even mathematical. It was more about simply the diversity of artifacts. Like instead of looking at it locationally, saying ki, in grid A1, let's say I have got 25 artifacts, grid A2 has maybe only 7. I will dig into 25. Instead of that, what we were saying is look at who's 25 in it. Just look at which are the ones that have the most material diversity, or which are the ones that have this kind of material, let's say copper more than clay, things like that. Right? So that is what helped us transform it, because that also kind of ties in very much to the idea of slow motion. And that is actually what, just detaching ourselves from pure number and pure location data and actually trying to incorporate these other aspects is what ended up getting correct method.
When you are using gyroscope also to get that angle I have?
Yes, yes. So the field toolkit actually, sorry? It's an ODK based open development kit based app. So the front end is this thing called Kobo Toolbox, and the back end is the open development kit framework. So it's actually a very easy thing to create. It's almost like a Google form kind of thing that you can keep creating, and then it becomes an app on it.
For the beginning part where we have the LLM is hallucinating, so people can use some skills. We have more special statistics inbuilt.
Correct.
We won't get that.
Correct. Even so, a lot of now we see a lot of these LLM making their way directly into software like GI software. There's Geo AI, it's called, right? Now the problem is now a lot of groups are working on it just to implement model context protocols properly, so that when I'm asking it for something, it's not looking at some other kind of data altogether. So even just trying to sandbox it into an environment is now starting to become a real thing.
All right, so I think we also run out of time. So big round of applause from you. Yeah, thanks. So I think I think it's been a great start for a seminar series. I think we have 3 months to go and we should keep the audience interested.
I'd love to attend some of the
So
other.
you are most welcome. I mean, our attempt was that WhatsApp group is to do that. So that's a request again to everybody to inform people both in campus, outside campus. We are also doing this live. It's also going to go live on YouTube. This time, the YouTube has worked well, right? All right. So then that makes it so our YouTube channel this time was with the Facebook YouTube will become much more accessible. So please do come in person. Please tell your classmates, your hostel friends, and of course inform everybody. But thank you so much, Anshul. That's been fascinating. I'm going to invite our first year architect Shraddha to come and give a small token of our appreciation. Ashwaya, you remember? Okay. I also brought your. So this is a small hand. You can give it to Shraddha. We can give it to. It's a Kalamkari hand block printed handloom stole from Andhra.
Wow.
So a little.
Oh my God.
Can somebody take over? Let me go. Use your phone for something useful. And you pay enough. Yeah. No, you have to pose for the photo. Thank you. Thank you. So next Tuesday, probably 6 o'clock meeting in this auditorium will be informed. Thank you very much, everyone.